open the door, you know this house. Even if you've never been inside it, you know this house. You knew it in 1994. You knew it in your grandmother's kitchen. You knew it in the background of a home video shot on a camcorder the size of a toaster. You knew it in real estate listings that still somehow exist today. Frozen, untouched, like a fly in amber. Walk in. The banister curves up the staircase, its spindles turned on a lathe somewhere in North Carolina, and they are the color of a manila folder left in the sun. The kitchen cabinets glow. Not white, not brown, but something in between, something almost orange, something that catches the afternoon light like a jar of clover honey held up to a window. The bathroom vanity matches. The medicine cabinet matches. The built-in desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one nobody uses for anything except mail and car keys, matches too. Every surface that could conceivably be made of wood is made of this wood, or at least it's veneered, laminated, or thermofoil wrapped to look like this wood, and it is always, without exception, the same wood, the same color, the same warm, slightly orange, slightly yellow, unmistakably 90s shade of oak. Design historians and, more accurately, thousands of exhausted homeowners on Pinterest have given it a name: honey oak. And here's the strange part. This wasn't a regional taste. This wasn't one town's fad, or one designer's signature, or one manufacturer's fluke. From Sacramento to suburban Connecticut, from a starter home in Ohio to a McMansion outside Toronto, from a flat in the English home counties to a townhouse in suburban Australia, an entire hemisphere of homeowners looked at this exact yellowish-orange wood and said unanimously, yes, this one. This is the one we all want. Think about how strange that actually is. We can't agree on pizza toppings. We can't agree on how to hang toilet paper. And yet, for roughly a decade, millions of unrelated people making independent decisions about their own private homes arrived at the same conclusion, down to the same stain color, applied to the same wood species, on the same style of cabinet door, with the same brass-toned hardware. That's not a coincidence. That's not taste. That's a system. So today, we're going to take that system apart. We're going to figure out why honey oak became the default finish of an entire decade of domestic life, and why, almost as suddenly as it arrived, it vanished. We'll talk about design pendulums, plywood economics, polyurethane chemistry, the invention of the home improvement superstore, and the sitcoms that quietly sold you a kitchen without you ever noticing you were being sold anything at all. Because honey oak wasn't just a color, it was a decade's entire idea of what home was supposed to look like, mass-produced at a scale no design trend has ever quite matched, before or since. This is yesterday architecture, and this is the story of the wood that ate the 90s. Act 1. The rebellion against the 80s. To understand honey oak, you first have to understand what it was running away from. Picture a kitchen in 1986. The cabinets are high-gloss black laminate, or maybe stark white, edged in a thin band of chrome. The countertop is a shiny black granite look laminate, or, if the homeowner is feeling bold, a jet black lacquer with flecks of gold. There's a glass block wall dividing the kitchen from the sunken living room. The light fixtures are halogen, aimed at odd angles, casting the kind of cool, clinical glow you'd expect from a nightclub, not a place where someone microwaves a hot pocket. This was the aesthetic of Miami Vice, of Dynasty, of glass and brass office towers reflected in mirrored sunglasses. It was engineered to look expensive, urban, and futuristic. It borrowed from Memphis Group postmodernism and corporate high-tech design, and filtered it down into tract homes and suburban remodels. It was cold on purpose. It was supposed to look like money, and by the tail end of the decade, People were exhausted by it. There's a pattern in design history, almost a law of physics, where every dominant aesthetic eventually curdles into its own cliché. And the backlash arrives right on schedule. The 1980s had spent a decade telling everyone that home should look like the lobby of a boutique hotel, sleek, hard-edged, reflective, cold. By 1988, 1989, that message had saturated so completely that it started to feel less like luxury and more like a symptom of excess, of Wall Street greed, of a decade that in hindsight had gotten a little full of itself. So the pendulum swung hard. What replaced glass and chrome wasn't another futuristic material. It was the opposite instinct entirely. A craving for warmth, for texture, for something that looked handmade, even if it absolutely was not handmade. Design magazines in the late 80s and early 90s started running headlines about cottage charm, country kitchens, and the return of craftsmanship. Laura Ashley florals bloomed across wallpaper. Quilts came out of the attic and back onto beds as intentional decor rather than hand-me-downs. Wicker baskets, dried flower wreaths, gingham curtains, and everywhere, constantly, insistently, oak. Call it the country and cottage craftsman revival if you want a tidy label for it. It wasn't really one specific style so much as a mood, a nostalgia for a version of domestic life that felt grounded, warm, and unmistakably not corporate. If the 80s were about looking like you just stepped out of a boardroom, the early 90s were about looking like you just stepped in from a farmhouse porch, even if your actual house was a brand new subdivision, built on a former cornfield 18 months earlier. And wood, real, solid, visibly grained wood, was the fastest, most legible way to signal that shift. Laminate said, modern, mass-produced, disposable. Oak said, quality, tradition, something your grandparents would recognize. It didn't matter that the oak in question was often a quarter-inch veneer glued onto particle board. What mattered was the message it sent the moment you walked in the door. This is a pattern you'll see again and again in design history. A reaction isn't really a rejection of a material. It's a rejection of what that material came to mean. Nobody in 1991 hated the color black. They hated what black lacquer had come to represent: coldness, artifice, an aesthetic that had aged badly in real time. Oak, meanwhile, carried centuries of cultural weight as the wood of English furniture, American colonial craftsmanship, church pews, library shelves. It was the wood of permanence. So, when the design world went looking for warmth, tradition, and reassurance after a decade of chrome, oak wasn't a random choice. It was the obvious choice. It was practically preloaded into the cultural imagination as the wood you reach for when you want a home, to feel like a home again. But choosing oak as a concept is one thing. Explaining why an entire hemisphere of new construction ended up with the exact same orange-tinted stain on that oak, that's a different question. And the answer to that one isn't really about taste at all. It's about factories. Act 2. The manufacturing and economic boom. The 1990s were, for American and Western suburbia broadly, a housing boom of genuinely staggering scale. Interest rates were dropping through the decade. The economy, particularly from 1993 onward, was expanding. A generation of baby boomers was moving into their prime home buying and home upgrading years, and a fresh wave of tract home builders, names like KB Home, Pulte, Toll Brothers, Ryan Homes, were building entire communities not house by house, but hundreds of houses at a time, off a shared set of floor plans and a shared set of finished packages. And that last part is the key to this entire mystery. Finished packages. When you buy a new construction home from a national builder, then and now, you're not choosing your cabinets from an infinite universe of possibilities. You're choosing from a short list. Builders negotiate massive bulk contracts with a small number of cabinet manufacturers, flooring suppliers, and hardware companies, because buying 10,000 identical cabinet doors is dramatically cheaper per unit than buying 10,000 different ones. Economies of scale don't just apply to cars and electronics. They apply to your kitchen. So the question becomes, out of the finishes available to those manufacturers in, say, 1991, which one checked the most boxes at once? Oak, it turned out, checked almost all of them. First, oak was abundant. North America has enormous native oak forests, particularly red oak, which grows relatively fast and is harvested at industrial scale across the Appalachians and the Midwest. Unlike more exotic hardwoods, mahogany, teak, rosewood, oak didn't need to be imported. It didn't carry the cost or the environmental scrutiny of tropical hardwoods. It was, quite literally, in America's backyard. Second, it was durable. Oak is a dense, hard, close-grained wood that resists dings, scratches, and warping far better than softer woods like pine. For a cabinet door that's going to get slammed shut by a family of 4 for the next 20 years, that durability matters enormously, both to the builder trying to avoid warranty callbacks and to the homeowner who doesn't want their kitchen falling apart. Third, and maybe most importantly, oak was easy and cheap to mass-produce with the manufacturing technology of the era. By the 1980s and 90s, cabinet doors weren't being hand-carved by a craftsman in a workshop. They were being run through automated shaper machines that could stamp out thousands of identical raised panel or cathedral arch door fronts a day. Oak's grain pattern, bold, visible, with those distinctive tiger stripe ray flecks, actually worked in its favor here, because it looked rich and detailed, even under a quick uniform factory finish. You didn't need an artisan's touch to make oak look substantial. The wood did that work for you. So builders standardized on oak, cabinet manufacturers standardized on oak, and once oak became the default, the entire supply chain, from lumber mills to finish lines to the builder's showroom, optimized around producing oak cabinetry as efficiently and cheaply as physically possible. That's how a material goes from a popular choice to the only choice you're realistically offered in the space of about 3 years. But that still leaves the color. Why this specific orange? Here's where the chemistry comes in. And it's honestly one of the more delightful accidents in 20th century design history. Raw, freshly cut oak is actually fairly pale, a light tan, sometimes almost blonde. To protect that wood and give it durability and shine, manufacturers apply a clear polyurethane topcoat. And polyurethane, especially the oil-based polyurethane that was standard through the 80s and 90s, has a well-known property. It ambers with age and UV exposure. Oil-based polyurethane contains compounds that yellow and deepen over time as they're exposed to sunlight and simple oxidation, a chemical process not unlike how a cut apple browns, just dramatically slower. A cabinet that left the factory looking like a light honey blonde in 1991 would, by 1998 or 2001, have deepened into that unmistakable warm orange amber that we now instinctively recognize as honey oak. The finish itself was aging in real time, right there on your kitchen wall, slowly turning more golden every single year it sat under your kitchen window. This is genuinely one of the most fascinating parts of the honey oak story. It wasn't a single stain color that manufacturers all happened to choose. It was a chemical inevitability built into the finishing process itself. Manufacturers were often applying a fairly neutral or lightly golden oak stain underneath that polyurethane. But the topcoat's own amber drift did enormous work in pushing every single one of these kitchens toward the same orange destination, regardless of which factory or which builder produced them. Different companies, different stains, different regions. And yet the shared chemistry of oil-based polyurethane pulled them all toward a strikingly similar endpoint. It's part manufacturing standardization, part slow-motion chemical reaction, which is a strange thing to say about a kitchen, but there it is. And then there's the third leg of this stool, access. Home Depot had opened its first stores in 1979, but it was through the 1980s and explosively into the 1990s that the home improvement superstore model truly took over American retail, joined by Lowe's aggressively expanding nationally over the same period. By the early to mid-90s, nearly every mid-sized American suburb had one of these cavernous orange or blue warehouses within a short drive, stocked floor to ceiling with exactly the kind of oak trim, oak cabinet fronts, oak stair parts, and oak-look laminate flooring that builders were installing in new construction. This mattered enormously because it meant honey oak wasn't confined to new homes. If you owned an older house, a 1960s ranch, a 1970s split level, you could now walk into a Home Depot on a Saturday afternoon and, for a genuinely accessible price, buy the same aesthetic that was showing up in every brand new subdivision on the edge of town. DIY culture and the home improvement superstore turned honey oak from a builder's default into a homeowner's aspiration. You didn't need to buy a new house to get the new kitchen. You just needed a weekend, a truck rental, and a Saturday afternoon of confidence you probably didn't fully deserve. So, by the middle of the decade, you've got three forces converging perfectly. Builders standardizing on oak for cost and durability. Polyurethane chemistry pushing that oak toward the same warm orange over time. And home improvement retail making that exact look available to literally anyone with a credit card and a free Saturday. That's not a trend anymore. That's an entire economic and industrial ecosystem, all quietly pointing the same direction. And once an ecosystem like that exists, it doesn't stay quiet for long. It gets on television. Act 3. The cultural peak in saturation. In December of 1994, a new cable channel launched with a mission statement that, in retrospect, feels almost quaint. An entire network devoted exclusively to homes, to gardens, to the small specific satisfactions of picking out cabinet hardware. HGTV arrived at precisely the moment the honey oak aesthetic was reaching critical mass, and it did more than just document that aesthetic. It became one of the primary machines manufacturing consensus around it. Home improvement shows in the mid-90s didn't really present style as a matter of personal taste, the way design media often frames it today. They presented it as a matter of correct execution. There was a right way to renovate a kitchen, and the right way over and over again involved oak cabinetry, brass hardware, and a color palette of hunter green, burgundy, and mauve. Watching these shows didn't feel like being shown options. It felt like being shown the answer. And it wasn't just HGTV. Honey oak was quietly, constantly present in the background of the decade's biggest sitcoms. The kind of show that were shot on sound stages built to look like idealized, aspirational, unmistakably middle-class homes. Tim Allen's tool-obsessed dad on Home Improvement fixed things in a suburban Michigan kitchen, finished in warm oak. The Tanner family's San Francisco Victorian on Full House was retrofitted inside, with the same golden cabinetry showing up in brand new subdivisions 2,000 miles away. Even Seinfeld, set in an urban Manhattan apartment building that should have had nothing in common, architecturally, with a suburban tract home, still leaned on warm wood tones and oak tone trim in its supporting sets. Television doesn't just reflect domestic taste, it rehearses it. When millions of households are watching the same sitcom kitchen every single week, that kitchen stops registering as a choice someone made and starts registering as simply what a kitchen is supposed to look like. It becomes wallpaper for the imagination. You're not consciously analyzing the cabinet finish, but you are absorbing it, week after week, as the neutral, unremarkable backdrop of a normal American life. This is how an aesthetic goes from a design trend to the default setting of an entire culture's imagination. And once that happens, something interesting and slightly cruel starts to occur in the market. In 1991, honey oak cabinetry was, in many markets, a genuine upgrade. It cost more than the laminate or the painted MDF options builders offered as their absolute base package. Choosing oak signaled that you'd paid for something better, that you cared, that you'd invested in your home. But by 1999, that relationship had almost completely inverted, because every builder had standardized on it, because every manufacturer had scaled production around it. Oak cabinetry had become the cheapest, most default option available, the thing you got automatically unless you paid extra to upgrade to something else, like maple, cherry, or a painted finish. The exact same material that had once signaled I chose quality, now signaled I bought the base package. This is where the term builder grade enters the vocabulary. And it's worth sitting with how strange that phrase actually is. It doesn't describe a specific quality level. It describes a psychological ceiling. Builder grade means this is what you get if you don't make a choice. It's the default, the path of least resistance. The finish selected not because a homeowner wanted it specifically, but because it was simply there, preloaded into the floor plan. And there's a deeper psychological mechanism at work here too, one that shows up again and again across design history. Scarcity creates desirability, and ubiquity destroys it. A material or a color can be objectively unchanged. The exact same oak, the exact same stain, and yet feel completely different depending on how many other people have it. When honey oak was novel, it read as warm, traditional, custom. When honey oak was in every single house on the cul-de-sac, it stopped reading as a design choice entirely and started reading as simply the default, invisible, the visual equivalent of beige carpet. You stopped seeing it as oak and started seeing it as just what kitchens look like. By the back half of the 1990s, that saturation had become almost total. And once a look becomes universal, once it stops signaling taste, money, or intention, and starts signaling nothing at all except this house exists, it becomes vulnerable, not because it got uglier, because it got ordinary. And in the design world, being ordinary is a much more dangerous position than being ugly. Something ordinary is ready to be replaced. Act 4. The Great Painting Over and the Fall of Honey Oak. The first wave to challenge honey oak's dominance came appropriately, right at the turn of the millennium, and it didn't reject wood as a material. It rejected oak's specific color, and it rejected it hard, in favor of something darker, richer, and, at the time, unmistakably aspirational, the early 2000s Tuscan and Old World revival. Suddenly, the design magazines were full of dark cherry cabinetry, wrought iron light fixtures, faux painted walls meant to look like Italian plaster, and the single most defining material shift of the era. Dark, speckled granite countertops replacing the laminate and light stone that had dominated the previous decade. If the 90s wanted cottage warmth, the early 2000s wanted Mediterranean villa, deeper, moodier, more saturated. Honey oak, with its pale, cheerful, almost cartoonish orange glow, suddenly looked less like tradition and more like a relic of a decade people were eager to distance themselves from. But the Tuscan wave, in hindsight, was really just a warm-up. The finish that would actually end honey oak's cultural reign arrived about a decade later, and it came from a completely different design philosophy altogether. Around 2010 through the mid-2010s, a new aesthetic consensus swept through American and Western homes with almost the exact same totalizing force honey oak once had, just aimed in the opposite direction, sometimes called millennial gray, sometimes tied to the specific, enormously influential rise of shows like Fixer Upper. This new look prized exactly what honey oak wasn't: cool tones instead of warm ones, flat matte surfaces instead of glossy amber ones, and, above all, white and gray shaker-style cabinetry. The visual grammar was almost a perfect photographic negative of the 90s kitchen. Where honey oak was warm, this was cool. Where honey oak had bold, visible wood grain, this favored smooth, grain-free painted surfaces. Where honey oak paired with brass hardware and hunter green accents, this paired with matte black fixtures, white subway tile, and quartz countertops engineered to look like flawless marble. And this is where honey oak's story takes its final, almost darkly funny turn. Because millions of homeowners in the 2000s didn't tear their honey oak kitchens out and replace them. They painted right over them. Chalk paint, a matte, easy-to-apply finish popularized enormously by DIY renovation culture, and figures like Annie Sloan became the tool of choice for an entire generation of homeowners looking to erase their parents' kitchen without the cost of a full remodel. You didn't need to rip out the cabinet boxes. You just needed to sand the finish, apply a coat of white or gray chalk paint, swap the brass hardware for matte black, and the honey oak kitchen cabinetry that structurally was often still perfectly sound would simply disappear, entombed under a fresh coat of paint, like a fossil in sediment. It's a strange kind of ending for a design trend, not demolished, not thrown out, but literally painted over and buried beneath the surface of the very houses it once defined. Somewhere underneath thousands and thousands of modern farmhouse kitchens across North America, there is still, technically, a honey oak cabinet door, quietly present, permanently hidden like a geological layer. By the time we reach the 2020s, honey oak has completed its full journey, from aspirational upgrade to inescapable default, to embarrassing dated relic, to something homeowners actively spend money to eliminate. Real estate listing photos from this era occasionally treat an untouched honey oak kitchen the way a home inspector treats knob and tube wiring. A red flag, a sign that this house hasn't been updated, even when every other system in the home is in perfect working order. And yet, look at the design world right now, today, in 2026. Scroll through the parts of the internet obsessed with grand millennial style, liminal space photography, or the aesthetic nostalgia baked into shows and games set in the 90s. Honey oak keeps resurfacing, not as something to renovate away, but as something people are actively, deliberately seeking out. There's a particular kind of warmth in those spaces, a specific quality of afternoon light bouncing off amber cabinetry that a decade of white shaker kitchens simply cannot replicate. It's the same warmth those original 1990s homeowners were chasing when they turned their backs on 80s chrome and black lacquer in the first place. Design trends, it turns out, don't really die. They just go dormant, waiting for the next generation to rediscover them with fresh eyes and no memory of how exhausting it felt to live inside them the first time around. The 80s came back as the aesthetic backdrop for an entire wave of neon-soaked synthwave nostalgia. The 70s came back in earth-toned, rounded grandma chic interiors. It would be strange, honestly, if honey oak, an aesthetic that once covered an entire hemisphere's worth of kitchens simultaneously, didn't eventually get its own turn on the nostalgia carousel. So maybe the real story of honey oak isn't a story about a wood finish falling out of fashion. Maybe it's a story about how every generation of homeowners reaches instinctively for the same feeling: warmth, permanence, the sense of a home that looks lived in, rather than showroom perfect, and just keeps landing on different materials to express it. Chrome gave way to oak. Oak gave way to white shaker. And somewhere out there, a design historian in the 2050s is probably already writing a video essay asking why an entire generation of the 2010s painted every single kitchen the exact same shade of matte gray. Because that's really what all of this is. Not a story about oak. A story about how a house tries, generation after generation, to feel like home. And how, every single time, an entire culture somehow ends up agreeing on the exact same way to do it. Thanks for watching.